Well, thanks for joining me. We're going to dive right in here. The Respect for Marriage Act is going to be hitting the Senate floor on Wednesday. What can you tell us about this legislation?
Yeah, well, this deceptively named Respect for Marriage Act really disrespects the American people and threatens our most basic freedom. What it does is requires the federal government to recognize any type of marriage that's recognized by a state. But in doing so, it threatens religious liberty. It empowers the federal government with these broad new powers to go after people of faith, faith-based organizations, and others that hold traditional views about marriage, biblically based views about marriage, and gives the federal government broad powers to punish organizations and people that hold those views.
So there's a lot to unpack there, because you mentioned something interesting about different types of marriage. Obviously, in America, when we talk about marriage, we know the debate has been between traditional marriage and then same-sex marriage, right? Which is a more recent phenomenon after the Supreme Court legalized it a few years back. But this, you said, would basically open the door to any type of marriage a state recognizes, correct?
That's exactly right. When you read the language of this so-called Respect for Marriage Act, it's requiring the federal government to recognize anything that a state law may pass. So if they do marriages between siblings or close relatives, if they do time-bound marriages, or even marriages between young children and adults, all of that would be bound upon the federal government, requiring the federal government to recognize that. And so we see us going from the days when we recognized marriage as the union of one man and one woman, and then since Obergefell, we're seeing sort of the door opened, and this is going to continue to open that door open wide to all these different understandings being pushed into federal law, and then likewise turned around and enforced on people of faith and organizations that serve their communities from a faith-based perspective.
Well, and it is interesting because people are going to hear what you said and they're going to say, oh, that would never happen. You know, those things would never be legalized. Right now, though, polygamy, if I'm not mistaken, there was a New York judge not that long ago who commented on polygamy, and others have as well, sort of opening the door to, pushing more legalization of that. So let's say states suddenly said, oh, you could be married to 5 people. Under this legislation, if I'm understanding you correct, the federal government would have to recognize those unions then.
Yeah, that's right. So under the version that passed out of the House and it's moved to the Senate, it would require recognition of even polygamous marriages and requiring the federal government to recognize that. And again, turning it around and telling, let's say, a faith-based adoption provider, we don't care that you believe marriage is between one man and one woman, unless you are willing to adopt to this polygamous couple or this other marriage that violates your beliefs about marriage, we're going to punish you. We're going to strip away your funding. We're going to take away your license to be able to serve kids in your communities. So we see how this explosion of what marriage means is going to have these severe consequences for so many people across the country.
One of the issues that came to mind, because obviously you have churches, you have nonprofit organizations that are Christian in nature and that don't want to dive into the same-sex arena, right? You have that. But the other big thing here is you have businesses, right? I mean, how many court cases have we seen? And some of them have even gone to the Supreme Court, and I'm sure more are headed that way, where you've got a baker or you have a business owner and they're saying, oh, we are a for-profit business, but we don't want to make cakes or perform at a same-sex wedding. How would those people be affected under the current legislation?
Yeah, I think this is part of this bigger aggression that we're seeing towards people of faith that hold to the view that marriages between man and one woman. So whether the Jack Phillips, the Colorado cake baker, or Alliance Defending Freedom has a case that's going to be argued at the Supreme Court in a matter of weeks on behalf of a Colorado artist, Lori Smith, who does custom websites and others and wants to be able to create custom websites consistent with her view of marriage. People of faith are coming under increased aggression from the federal government and state governments over their beliefs about marriage and family. And so what the so-called Respect for Marriage Act is going to do is give more authority to the federal government to be able to enforce this broad understanding that marriage is anything that a state says it is, and be able to go after people of faith, to go after organizations of faith and say, unless you comply with this, you can face lawsuits, you can face federal government action, you could even potentially lose your tax-exempt status if you're a nonprofit organization. So all of these things are going to flow from this bill if it passes and becomes law.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, obviously the Democrats held the Senate and it looks like Republicans are going to hold the House, but at this point it doesn't really matter when we're talking about this, because you have a situation where there's a bipartisan group here. You've got some Republicans in the mix in the Senate, and they are claiming that they've come to this resolution and that they have dealt with this religious freedom issue. I mean, the claim is essentially that all the things that we're talking about here in this Senate version of the bill would be remedied. How do you respond to that? I'm sure you've seen those claims surrounding this.
We have, they pay lip service to religious liberty, making the same types of things to say, oh, nothing in this bill will affect religious liberty. But the concern is, how is the federal government going to use this bill? Because we've seen time and time again under the Biden administration and under the Obama administration beforehand, that they take seemingly innocuous language and use it against people of faith, use it to force Catholic hospitals to perform gender transition surgeries on young kids. And so the concern is, when you're giving these broad new powers to the federal government, whatever lip service they may be paying in this amendment is not going to take away the fact that we are completely blowing up the understanding of marriage, disrespecting people and organizations that believe marriage is between one man and one woman, and opening them up to lawsuits, not just from the federal government, but from other people. It's going to allow these faith-based organizations to just be sued by citizens that disagree with them. And so whatever they may say in this, it's still creating vast new powers for the government and other people to go after people of faith and the organizations that they work in that serve their communities.
Now you're the attorney here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that this has worked so far, when you have bakers and others who have, refused to make a cake, those issues, they tend to be handled at these commissions, state commissions at the state level. It seems to all be happening at the state level. I have not seen things happening at the federal level, but what you're saying here is that this particular law could essentially then open the door for federal issues as well and federal lawsuits. Would that be an accurate depiction of what you're saying?
That's absolutely correct. And so the bills that passed the House allows a cause of action, allows any American to sue another person, another organization, if they're considered a state actor. And that's just a fancy way of saying they work with the state in some way. And so that's why I brought up the example of like a social service organization, maybe a food pantry that cooperates with the local government to serve their community. Well, if that food pantry is operated by a church and they say, we hold to the belief that marriage is between one man and one woman, someone could now sue that church, sue that food pantry, sue that religious organization under this bill. So now, just like you said, those legal actions that beforehand had largely been in the state and that ADF has been defending people of faith and organizations for years now, we're now going to see a wide open door for federal lawsuits to be brought against these individuals, these organizations that are just wanting to serve their communities consistent with their beliefs about marriage and family.
So my final question for you, because I know you have been very active in this and ADF has been as well at the state level, as you just said. I know you've also written at least 2 letters on this, encouraging Mitch McConnell to push back against this and really sounding the alarm on some of the claims you just talked about and what could happen as a result of this. What will you do moving forward if on Wednesday this ends up being passed and we have a situation where this is going to be law? How does ADF respond?
Number one, we're going to continue to stand for marriage. And that means we're going to stand with people and organizations that believe marriage is between one man and one woman. So whether it's the IRS knocking on the door saying, we're going to take away your tax exempt status, or even these organizations facing a federal lawsuit for standing firm on their belief that marriage, ADF is going to continue to stand with them and push back. And that's going to mean challenging this law in court and saying, whatever it may say, you cannot undermine our constitutionally protected freedoms. You can't undermine our freedom of religion. You cannot undermine our freedom of speech. And you cannot enforce these federal laws against people of faith that undermine their convictions about what marriage is.
Matt Sharp, I appreciate you dropping by to break this all down for us. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.